Today, for our Experts in Emotion interview, we have the honor of speaking with Dr. Dacher Keltner, a former mentor of mine, on the nature of embarrassment and what function it serves for the greater good of humanity. So Dr. Keltner received his PhD from Stanford University and completed his NIMH postdoctoral training with Paul Ekman at the University of California, San Francisco. He's currently a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as the director for the Greater Good Science Center that is focused on translating the theories, insights, findings, and practices of social psychology of compassion and cooperation for a broader audience of educators, policymakers, healthcare providers, and just generally interested citizens. He's also authored The Compassionate Instinct as well. Dr. Keltner, not surprisingly, has received many awards, including the Templeton Positive Psychology Excellence and Research Prize, Outstanding Mentor and Teacher Awards from UC Berkeley, and was also named as one of the 50 visionaries for 2008 by the Utne Reader. Thanks for talking with us today, Dacher.
It's great to be here, June.
It's great to talk to you, as always. One of the things I wanted to start out asking you is something that I'm sure a lot of people are curious about, which is what got you interested in emotion in the first place? Kind of, where did it all begin?
Well, for me, it really begins very early in life, which is that I was raised by a literature professor who was interested in romanticism and poetry and women's literature. And then I was raised by an artist. And I had a dad who took me to art museums to study paintings. And I distinctly remember the day, in the late 1980s, hearing a talk by Paul Ekman, where he was really starting to, to popularize and present the idea that you could capture emotion in the moment, in the millisecond, with the facial action coding system. And that blew me away. That, all these things I've been thinking about and looking at in paintings and sculpture and hearing about in literature, you could actually study in any part of the world scientifically. And so that kind of got me there. And then it really was a matter of being raised intellectually in the 1980s in graduate school. It was really the heyday of cognitive science and all the promise of that discipline. And then to think, how do we build emotion into our understanding of the mind? And so that's why I do what I do.
That's lovely. Wow. So once you got hooked on, this fun and mysterious world of emotion, you've done such cool research ever since then. And for me, as a student of yours, I was so excited by all the different things you were doing. And I'd just love to ask you now a few questions about your research, starting with embarrassment. So, when we think about embarrassment, it's something that we can all readily imagine, though, with, some reluctance about some time in our life. We felt that pang, of embarrassment. And I think many of us during those experiences wonder to ourselves, why in the heck do I have this emotion of embarrassment? What good is it for me? Sort of, what function does it serve in the first place? And I wondered if you could just say, since your work really pioneered our understanding of the social function of embarrassment, why we have it there and what sort of social purpose it serves for us.
Well, that's a great place, and that's where I really began. And in fact, you are in good company, because Charles Darwin, 1872, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, he really didn't quite capture the kind of the social functions of embarrassment. And he wrote about kind of this crazy theory about how, we blush when we get embarrassed because it really tracks our attention to our bodies. And he didn't offer kind of the more social, functional approach to embarrassment that he did for other emotions. And so what we've come to through lots of research and literature reviews is the idea that embarrassment, even though it's really painful to you, and you in particular, June, right?
Yes, I can't stand embarrassment.
Me neither, And in fact, studies find people will pay money not to get embarrassed. But it has this incredibly important social function, which is that We feel embarrassment when we make social mistakes that hold the social fabric together, and we signal our mortification and our concern over other people's opinions in the social contract through the nonverbal display of embarrassment. So put simply, it's a way in which we trigger forgiveness in others.
So what might be the potential disadvantages of living a life without embarrassment? I know a lot of people would love to have such a life perhaps, but it sounds like it would have sort of these grave consequences on our social well-being.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the important forms of data that we've gathered in different places, as has other laboratories, to really make this case for embarrassment being a way to trigger appeasement and reconciliation when we've made mistakes. So, we've studied people who suffer a particular form of orbital frontal cortex damage, and they have a lot of trouble following social rules, and they just don't show embarrassment like we show embarrassment, right? It's in the inappropriate context. There are other studies finding that, people, this is James Blair's work, that if you, people who really have trouble following the moral code and social norms, they likewise show really surprising deficits in understanding embarrassment, signaling it at the right time. So what that tells us, and there are other studies like this, that even though it's painful to the self, and we'd really rather not feel the emotion, it's really essential to folding into cooperative social communities.
And I mean, one of, I think, the most memorable parts of your work on embarrassment is, identifying this prototypical display of what embarrassment looks like.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that and, your comfort level, not to elicit embarrassment, but maybe show us what it looks like too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I was working in Paul Ekman's laboratory as a postdoc in 1990 to 1992. And I was learning how to code facial expression and learning the kind of the Darwinian tradition of emotion. And as part of that postdoc, I was doing a project on the startle response. And what we had done is we had startled UC Berkeley undergraduates unexpectedly to sort of assess how stressed out they were. And the startle turns out to be a really good measure of how stressed out you are. And so these poor undergrads were sitting there, and we just blasted them with this loud noise. And bam! They show the startle response, and I was coding that startle response, and it's 7 muscle movements that happen in about 400 or 500 milliseconds. Really hard to code anatomically. And what's funny is about half the people, when they get startled, their head jolts and they kind of lose body composure, and I think they wet their pants, and they get totally embarrassed, right? And I was coding it frame by frame, and right after they pulled themselves together after being startled, I saw this incredible display, right? They look down, they tilt their heads, they show their necks, which is an interesting mammalian display. They pucker their lips, they smile, they touch their face a quarter of the time. And I went to the literature that Darwin inspired, and no one had really described that display, right? And it had all the properties that people in animal signaling and Paul Ekman and Charles Darwin have written about that really define emotional expressions, which is, it was about 5 seconds long, it was really coordinated, and when we consulted the non-human appeasement literature, a lot of species do similar kind of small behaviors to show submissiveness. So we did a lot of work to show that display of tilting your head down, looking down, showing your neck, having this awkward, controlled smile is really a signal of embarrassment, and it's proving to be the case.
I mean, and one of the coolest things about your work is you took this interdisciplinary approach, like you're saying, not just drawing from psychology, but also, anthropology and biology. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of what does this tell us about, the need for an interdisciplinary approach more broadly when we study any kind of emotion, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I hope your students and your audience really appreciate this, but emotion has always been, since its founding day in the social biological sciences, interdisciplinary at its heart, right? And some of the great insights into the nature of emotion come from anthropologists who are living with remote peoples, like Kathy Letts, writing about the Ifiluk. Some of the great insights in understanding kind of display behavior where I work really come out of analyses of other mammals, right? What do mammals do when they vocalize? What do mammals do when they signal different kinds of fear or appeasement displays? Or how far down the mammalian line do you see laughter, right? Or hear laughter? So that, June, it's really so important you highlight that, because that thrilled me about the field, which is that you can be reading anthropology and neuroscience and studies, Frans de Waal's studies of primate hierarchies, all to understand these things we call emotions.
That's lovely. I mean, it makes me think too about the same kind of approach you took towards understanding and sort of unearthing this realm of positive emotion. And I feel like, I can't imagine a conversation with you that doesn't touch on this topic where, I mean, up until that date, really there had been this understanding of positive emotion as this sort of unidimensional kind of broad umbrella term, just positive affect. And your work really pioneered sort of uncovering these different flavors or nuances of positive emotions, ranging from, pride to gratitude to awe and compassion. And in many ways, this has changed the landscape of how we think about what positive emotion is to this day. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about the story of, getting into this field where there really hadn't been much work done, and how you think this has changed the way we think about the landscape of positive emotion now.
Yeah, you trace it so nicely historically, which is that, the field of emotion starts gaining a lot of momentum, and, today I think it's right to claim that we are in part of an emotion revolution, right? And people like David Brooks and Malcolm Gladwell and others are fascinated by our science, as is the field. And when I took stock in the early 2000s of the field and have been teaching emotion like you for 20 years, it was like we had these really rich stories about anger and fear and sadness and disgust and shame and embarrassment and guilt and all this tough stuff of life, right, which fits in an evolutionary framework. And we just didn't have a lot to say about positive emotions, gratitude or love or compassion or beauty or awe. Now, it's interesting, most early conceptualizations of emotion, like Aristotle, some of the early philosophers, had a lot of positive emotions in there, right? Early philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, were really interested in the feeling of reverence and beauty. And so what we've started to do is to kind of take different positive emotions and really start to map what they look like physiologically, what they look like in terms of display behavior, how you think about them theoretically. And we now know, there are really important distinctions between compassion, and which Darwin felt was our strongest instinct, versus gratitude, which feels really closely connected to it. There are interesting distinctions between the feeling of beauty and the feeling of awe, right? Or love and desire. So I think it's I think it's one of the most exciting places to be in our field, is to really push those. And it really tells us very deep stories about why did we become cooperative as a species or altruistic? Studying emotions will provide some clues.
I mean, I couldn't agree more that it's one of the most exciting, topics one could research. And it's, the kind of excitement and enthusiasm you talk about when describing, the landscape of positive emotion. It's what got me interested in it in the first place. I know has inspired a lot of other people since then who've known you or, watched your lectures on human emotion. One of the things that I wonder, I know you're the director of the Greater Good Science Center, author of Born to Be Good. And in a lot of these writings and efforts, there's a lot of talk about how we can take or leverage this, scientific understanding of positive emotions and feelings like compassion to sort of foster a better society, a more compassionate society. And I just wonder what your thoughts are of how we can translate what we know about positive emotion for the greater good of humanity.
Yeah, so, you know, that I've been privileged to be part of the Greater Good Science Center and, to have that opportunity to think about how lab findings might make for, more empathetic schools or, help improve the nature of American healthcare or help leaders lead in more pro-social ways. And I think what we're starting to see, June, is, because the science is getting so strong, right, on things like gratitude, compassion, touch, which I've studied, and how we touch to convey compassion or gratitude, this ancient physiological system. I think we're starting already to see the scientific literature on these topics become practices and interventions in applied settings. So, the mindfulness work on compassion, right, which there's now 25 peer-reviewed studies at least showing if I practice loving kindness and if I think compassionate thoughts and really train the mind, right, and breathe deeply, kind of these traditions in Buddhist thought, people's health improves, depressive symptoms drop, people do better in school, immune system improves. That's becoming, when I get out into the world and talk to executives or healthcare providers or the like, they know about this and they're doing it. Another one that's happening is gratitude, right? Where, there are, we are at the Greater Good Science Center hosting a gratitude initiative in collaboration with the Templeton Foundation. Schools are starting to have little gratitude diaries and reflections. And we know scientifically that's good news. So I think it's a great time for people like you and me to take the science and push it out into the culture.
So then when you think about kind of pushing science into the culture and sort of where the field of emotion is headed, I mean, what are your thoughts? Like, where are we moving towards?
Well, I think I think that one growth area is clearly the positive emotions. And so, we've just hosted an initiative on gratitude. There are so many incredible investigations of gratitude that, gratitude is the emotion that Adam Smith, the great economist, 1757 or 9, in A Theory of Moral Sentiment said, this is what holds societies together, right? And now there are scientists working on how gratitude can make for, better responses to healthcare treatment or sort of more collaborative schools or the neurophysiology of gratitude and how it engages, dopamine-based reward circuitry, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the positive emotions. We're in my lab very interested in awe, and I know you and I have talked a lot about awe and done a little work there. The feeling of being in the presence of something bigger than the self, right? Some kind of collective art experience or political experience, religious, spiritual. And we're getting, the findings are incredible. Like you can take a typical person, you take them out into a grove of large trees, which inspired awe in Charles Darwin and John Muir and Emerson and so on. And they suddenly become more altruistic, right? Just for 5 minutes looking up into some trees.
Wow.
They define the self in different ways. So I think positive emotions are going to be a very exciting place. I think, positive health, people starting to think about, the role of emotion and positive emotion and stress management in, modifying stress physiology is going to be hugely interesting. I think the clinical applications, such the things that you're working on, and others starting to think about the place of emotion there. And I would add also like the realm of moral intuition. A lot of people are very inspired by John Haidt and others. wow, these emotions, they're not disruptive to consciousness. They're part of how we make reasoned decisions. So lots of great territory to work on.
Thanks, Dacher. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is one of the questions that's most special to me, which is about, the kind of advice that you give students who are thinking about embarking in emotion. And I say it's special because, I feel like the advice you give to students is so inspiring, and it's what got me interested in this field in the first place, and what has gotten a lot of other people who are now professors, grad students, and budding undergrads too. So someone who's known to give really inspirational advice, I'd love to ask you a bit about what kind of advice do you give to students these days who are thinking about embarking in the study of emotion?
Well, we've been lucky to to be part of this scientific moment where emotion, has really arrived as such a interesting area of inquiry. And the thing that I always challenge students to do, and in part it traces back to advice Paul Ekman gave me, and is really to find problems that haven't been worked on, and in our terminology, unexplained variants or things we just don't know about. When we started doing work on awe, there was no. For Jonathan Haidt and I first wrote a paper on awe, there were 11 papers in all of social science that referenced awe, and that is a great place to be. Right? Is to go where we do not have answers or paradigms. Right? It's harder. Got to invent methodologies and validate methodologies, but that's one. The second, and I think it's really interesting, is in some sense, people in the field of emotion get to study what's most mysterious to them personally, or what's most personally important, right? What is your signature passion or emotion? And for me, to end up studying beauty and awe is exactly where I began as a kid, right? Which is my parents and art and literature. So do that, and then do things that are risky. Take a chance.
That's great advice, Dacher, as always. So thanks for talking today, Dacher. Really appreciate it.
It's nice to be with you, June.
And this concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Dacher Keltner from the University of California, Berkeley.